Byron, what's up, man? Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Ryan, thanks a lot, brother. I've been looking forward to this, and this has been awesome. I love what you're doing. I love how you're challenging men. So this is awesome.
Yeah, well, you reached out a couple of weeks ago, and I think the timing was perfect, obviously, with what's going on in society and the contention and the frustration and animosity. And then we have the race conversation and COVID, and there's just so much uncertainty. And like I said a second ago, contention in the world right now that I thought, man, it would make sense for two mature men to have a conversation. I'm sure a lot of the things we'll agree on. Maybe there's some points where we don't necessarily agree. And I thought, let's hash this out. Like let's talk about these things in a mature way and model what a mature conversation can be and what it should look like.
Amen. I agree. I agree.
I don't know why it's so difficult these days for people to have mature conversations. I mean, that's what it comes down to. The lack of maturity is staggering. It's frustrating, and it's destructive generally because nothing gets done, nothing gets accomplished.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's amazing when when smart people act in stupid ways. I think a lot of it revolves around one. Well, let me just give you, kind of my background and my wife's background. We decided to homeschool our kids,
Mm.
and we followed a program called the Well-Trained Mind, and in it, it was very heavy on rhetoric, logic, and the ability to communicate your ideas in very critical ways. How to have critical conversations. That's what the whole program revolved around. And one thing that I noticed as my wife and I were taking our kids through this program for years is I started to realize, even in my own life and in the life of people in society, I really believe we've lost the art and the capacity as a culture to have substantive conversations that can run deep and address very emotionally charged issues, but in a very sane way. We've lost the art of communication. So one of the things that I'm hoping in this time that we can do, not just you and I, but people in general, is rekindle the art of conversation. Really learn how to speak and listen in such a way where even if and when your ideas are challenged, your whole worldview is challenged, your knee-jerk reaction isn't defensiveness, but instead it's evaluation and it's seeking out, okay, what's proof, what's evidence to separate the wheat from the shaft, and then hopefully come walk away being better off than we were at the beginning. I think that's a lost art, and hopefully we can continue to encourage and bring that back.
Sure. Yeah. As I'm listening to you say this, I think the root of it is an ego issue.
Oh yeah.
When you're, like you said, the worldview is challenged, it seems to me that if you aren't willing to at least entertain the idea, I'm not saying that you have to accept a conflicting view, but at least entertain the idea, that it's your ego getting in the way. And I'm not pointing fingers. I'm guilty of this too. When people challenge what I say, whether it's on the podcast or on social media, I'm like, well, yeah. And you're quick to come back and try to get at them. But I've just found that the more often I attempt to not be so prideful, so arrogant, have that ego in place, the more well-rounded I am. And frankly, the better off I am too, because I gain a perspective that I'd never considered before that shouldn't be posed as a threat, right? Like having another angle, why would anybody consider that a threat? That just rounds you out and gives you more information to make better decisions with.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Ryan Holiday came out with a book not too long ago called Ego is the Enemy, right? And he really started to look at Stoic teachings and, great philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Socrates, and all these guys. And the common theme was, what is the common denominator among great men who fall? It's ego. Ego is huge. And we all, again, are subject to that. And that's why I think, creating a personal foundation, a constitution that's built around self-efficacy and building one's self-esteem, not on status or looking good in front of our peers or our political party, but instead building a foundation on having that growth mindset, right? If everyone decides to embrace the growth mindset, ultimately we can both look at the same problem from different angles, as you said, but be hard on the problem and compassionate and respectful of the person. I think
Mm.
that's how we can handle it. It's not about being on opposite sides of the table all the time. In fact, if you look at the beauty of this American experiment, our founding fathers were brilliant in the idea, the concept of how do we want this nation to scale and grow. And it came up with this idea of a multi-partied system. Before that didn't exist. But the reason, the genesis for why that even existed, why we started to entertain the thought of that versus a monarchy, was because we recognized inherent in everyone's vision are blind spots. And if we wanted to navigate this country and grow and scale, we would have to aggressively and soberly look at the problems that are coming at us continuously, but do it in a setup where we're flanking, where we're attacking the problem from both sides, right? It's a military concept. And the reason why we flank is so that each of us can always point out and account for the other side's blind spots. That's the way, in theory, it's supposed to run, okay? And unfortunately, it's run amok, especially, in our day and age. But I'm hopeful that we can get back to that sort of rigorous discipline and as we address the real issues that we as a society faces.
I guess that's one of the challenges that I see when you have this new trend of dismissing or downplaying the importance of Independence Day, which we just celebrated.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about what that moment in time stood for, and although we as a country have fallen short of treating all men the same, right? It's clearly in our history we've fallen short of that promise. But that doesn't mean that wasn't a great moment in time. That doesn't mean that didn't put us in the right direction. It doesn't mean that we still aren't the greatest country and I think the country most free of racism, most free of real oppression. That's not to undermine or dismiss that we don't have those issues still.
Mm-hmm.
But our founding fathers created the framework or the foundation for us to continue to evolve and continue to improve and continue to attempt to meet those commitments we made 250 some odd years ago.
Yeah, I think a strong measure of the health of a nation, and especially a powerhouse like the United States has been over the last, 5 decades. If we can go back that far, I think our strength is measured by our ability to meet the demands of our current reality. And what I mean by that is no matter, and we can understand this, and let me use the example of sports. Coming from a sports background, I recognize that at all times I am up against two enemies, if you will, simultaneously. And one enemy is always greater than the other. I'm up against my opponent, my competition. All right, that's the external force that pushes against me by the nature of the game. But more importantly, there's a more insidious enemy or competitor that I have to always account for, and that is the enemy within. And if we don't constantly measure up to and account for the enemy within, success, affluence, succeeding can ultimately become our demise. And so what I mean by that, with America, we've been privileged enough, generally speaking, over the last 150 years, or let's just go back 100 years right before the Industrial Revolution. If you can recall back into the 1920s and even up to 1933, coming up to the Great Depression, we were experiencing a lot of growth, accelerated growth as a nation. Industrial Revolution came into play, and we started to scale and grow. Well, Great Depression in the 1930s hit America really hard. And it hit us hard because we were forced to recognize the economic model that we were operating under, okay? The force of capitalism and growth exposed the weakness, and that weakness caused the downturn. Now, whenever, I don't want to get too geeky around this, but I have a point when we fast forward to right now. Whenever an entity or a team or a person goes from one level to the next, we level up our game, right? What has to take place is our performance or our position always outpaces our capacity. All right. So you can be good at one level, and that's going to get you to the next level.
Right.
But that next level now requires different demands that require you to grow into in order to excel at that level. Well, when our ego gets involved, we stop looking at the enemy within. We stop looking at all of the factors that has gotten us to that next level and building on it. We stop evaluating. We stop pointing out what's wrong and what's dysfunctional. And we become more afraid of making the right pivots and corrections within our infrastructure that's necessary to sustain that growth. So I think it's important for us to what measures greatness is not how much we can win, but how much we're willing to improve and grow the system that we're operating in. That's what makes great athletes better than the rest. They are their own motivation. You know, when you look at Michael Jordan, you know, for instance, I just watched The Last Dance on Netflix, and, you know, it was just a story. One of the biggest things that came out of that for me, and I was showing my son, pointing this out, was Michael Jordan, whether you liked him or not. I mean, a lot of times he was very hard to get along with. Teammates will testify to that.
No
but
doubt.
one thing that he did consistently was that he demanded more of himself, from himself, than he did everyone else on the team. He didn't just point fingers. And anytime he pointed a finger at someone else, he was also pointing the finger back at himself. And I think that's the type of attitude all of us, especially us men, have to embrace. As much as we want to point out the flaws and the chinks in someone else's armor, we've got to be even more vigilant in doing that for ourselves.
You know, in addition to the challenges of us not being willing to look at ourselves, you're the problem, the president's the problem, the economy's the problem, and not turning it around on ourselves, I also believe that when we look at 300 plus million people in the country, we all have different ideas of what progress looks like. Mm-hmm. And what progress may look to somebody else might actually look like regression to somebody else.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of contention. So I really wanted to get granular and talk about, from your perspective, what are some of the problems that you see us facing that we're now dealing with? And then we can talk about how to deal with them effectively, or maybe even discuss and even debate, maybe to a degree, what those problems are, and then talk about some effective solutions in a mature, manly way.
Yeah. A very good question and good setup. One of the things that I think is an issue, a huge issue that we have to deal with, you know, is this idea of what is the relationship between law enforcement and our inner city or underdeveloped aspects of our community, our socioeconomically depressed communities. Because when we look at all of the statistics, you look at the statistics and you know, one side will point out, you know, the rate of black on black crimes. You know, it's black African Americans make up 3 to 6% of the population, depending on what stats you're looking at, and if you're looking specifically to African American males, and the rate of crime, you know, almost 50% of the crime is done. So that's very disproportionate. So someone can argue that all day long. Right. And then at the same time, you have to look at, okay, when we look at the aggregate of that and we kind of, you know, narrow down, where does the 80-20 rule apply? What is the actual agent within that group that's actually causing it? We can see that systemically there's a correlation between high crime and depressed socioeconomic areas. A lot of the factors around the urban system. Well, here's the issue. Back in the 1960s, the Supreme Court allowed for they recognized there was a problem with crime in the inner city, and the intent was good. The intent was, hey, there are good people, African American, Latino people, whoever, in the inner cities that need our protection and all. And what the Supreme Court allowed, and the way they empowered the police department was, hey, you could do something that's now known as stop and frisk. All right. That was a tactic that the police departments across the nation in our at-risk zones were allowed to exercise. And here you have a case of good idea, but over time, poorly executed. because what stop and frisk started to do is create a culture of mistrust between the police department and the community, and the community and the police department. So here you have well-meaning people on both sides, right? Police officers doing their job, wanting to serve the community, but doing it in such a way where a lot of times, basically, some of the statistics, especially in the 80s and the 90s, when this divide became very prevalent, you had about 93% of people that were stopped and frisked were innocent. All right, so you had 7% that actually, 7% charged, 3% actually convicted. So you had the vast majority of people experiencing in their quality of life day to day, the encounters that they had with police were confrontational and
right, and they interpret that as well, frankly, harassment. You know, I even look at it this way, and then I'll let you get back onto this point of checkpoints on the road for drunk drivers.
Right.
You know, it's like, I mean, I get what you're trying to do here, but how bad of a situation does it need to be where you're going to assume that everyone's bad before you assume that everybody's good? Right. So it turns into, like you said, a confrontational situation as opposed to, hey, we're going to enforce the laws that we know have been broken, versus, hey, we're going to go out actively looking for this stuff and target 97%. And I can't speak to the validity of that statistic, but let's just assume it's true.
Yeah.
Target 97% of the people inaccurately. That, of course, is a problem.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I'm not even saying that, hey, bad police department. Okay. I'm not even saying that, because let's look at, again, when we're getting granular and looking at the nuance of what are the drivers and incentives that police departments are forced to operate under. Okay. Mm-hmm. When you look at the police department, their measures, a lot of the times, and when we're talking again, Chicago inner cities, New York, there's a lot of data on New York, a lot of data on Miami, a lot of the high crime areas. A lot of these initiatives were aggressively put into place, mind you, by not only Republican but Democratic initiatives. Okay, you had Reagan and his team, and then you had their team, really having this war on crime effort. But that war on crime was geared toward the inner city. So what am I meaning? I'm saying that a lot of this, the police officers, good police police systems, were also, figuratively speaking, handcuffed, because in their mandates on what their grants and what their funding was going to be tied to and rewarded was on performance. Okay, it's a performance-driven model that started to really, really drive how policing was administered. Okay, which by nature began, and what was the performance? What was the measure? Rate of convictions, we see this in traffic all the time. Higher traffic, enforcement law stops, and specifically within the inner city or high crime areas, we wanted to see more arrests, because those were numbers that we could look to. They were numbers that proved the case the police department was doing their job.
We're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Doing what they're supposed to do. Well, that invites a lot of dysfunction within a system, especially when you're dealing with human beings, guys and gals who every single day have to run toward the fire, right? They go into situations that are high stakes, very intense, and have to do their job. So you're creating this situation where, unfortunately, bad things can potentially happen more often. Now, you contrast that with police departments that have been doing it right. I grew up in the inner city of East Cleveland, and I remember a program that was initiated by the police department called PAL, P-A-L, and that stood for Police Athletic Lead. The police department in inner city East Cleveland were funded to not only police, their beat, but actually they had money to become like the police officers were the coaches on all of these, on the basketball, football, baseball teams in
Right.
the inner city. They were
Interesting.
incentivized to spend a portion of their time cultivating and connecting with the community. All right. Well, when
I
that
would
fund,
even say, Byron, on that to go even a little further, based on what
Mhm.
I'm hearing you say, not only just cultivating within the community, but fathering within the community.
Yes, big time. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. If we look at another statistic, man, you look. There's a huge correlation with the demise of our nation, the downtrend of our nation, and the uptrend of fatherlessness across the
Definitely.
board. I don't care what
Definitely.
race you are,
Does
right?
not matter. Yes.
Doesn't matter. It is huge, and you're definitely right. Guys and young men, lessons are caught more than they're taught. And if you
Mm,
don't have other men modeling the good thing to do, modeling good thinking, modeling good behavior, right choices, modeling the work ethic necessary to make something out of nothing, when you don't have those things and then you replace those models with models that are fabricated because of media and social media, again, when there is still a correlation in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and it really shot up in the 80s, where gang and thug culture became cool. You see
mm,
it in our music, and I'm not saying, I love, rap music. I'm not trying to belittle this. What I'm saying is the celebration of the culture that the art platformed,
mm-hmm.
um, was very detrimental, because when in absence of frontline, boots on the ground, models, real men showing you what to do, you have, how you're supposed to live modeled by our media.
Right.
And that, I think, perpetuates and accelerates the problem.
I think what we run into is when we're so outcome driven, you get into a situation where the means justify the outcome.
Right.
And the means of stop and frisk and some of these, we'll call them questionable tactics, justify the outcome because you're so driven by the final result that it doesn't matter how you get there. And what I think we need to do is, instead of being so outcome oriented, we need to be more, what would be the best way to say it, process oriented, and
Yeah.
think more about, okay, what are the inputs? So if you look at the inputs, and I've seen studies on this, and there's three determinant factors primarily. There's a lot, of course, but there's three primary determinant factors that go into success, whether that's economic success, relational success, just a betterment of your life, staying out of criminal activity and living a richer, more fuller life. And the three metrics are having a mother and father in the home,
Mm-hmm.
having a minimum of a high school education or equivalent,
Yep.
and getting a job, going to work.
Yep.
And it seems to me that and I'm not talking about just the black community, I'm talking about the white community, I'm talking about just communities in general.
Yeah.
If we can ensure and even consider investing our financial resources into the two that I see primarily are education and ensuring there's opportunities for fathers or father figures to be involved with young men,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that a lot of these problems and these situations begin to work themselves out
Yeah.
because we worried about the front end as opposed to having to worry so heavily on the back end.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. I'm a systems guy, and I always challenge myself and my son and everything. Make the process the goal. Don't
Mm,
get so goal fixed that you get distracted by the outcome, and also discouraged by the outcome. Right? Sometimes
right.
the goal can be so large or so far that we think it's not possible. But
Well,
instead,
that's actually part of the problem too. Is you
yeah.
think about, okay, so we elect these politicians and they want to get reelected in 2 years or 4 years. So they need to produce immediate results. So when you're outcome fixed, you can skew or manipulate or put in some, again, like I say, questionable strategies and tactics to manipulate those outcomes in the short term, even though long term they may not serve you well.
Yep.
But educating our youth and ensuring there's not only father figures, but father-like figures in the communities in which we live is not a simple overnight thing. This is going to take 20 years because you've been talking about it since the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
40, 50 years of people being conditioned to behave this way, this isn't going to happen overnight.
Right. And then you're like, okay, if this is true, where do we get the fathers from, the dads from? Well, that means currently men who've run their lives with a dysfunctional internal operating system are now having to reform themselves from the inside out, right? Learn how to lead from the inside out. So now you got guys who are broken, who have to, before they can lead, before we can trust them to lead, have to reform themselves. And this is what I appreciate about what you're doing, the movement with Iron Council, and just what you're doing with your platform is like, hey, look, we've got to, as men, step one, take ownership of saying, look, we may not have been dealt the best hand in life, but we have agency, right? We can't assume a victim mentality or posture. We've got to take ownership. That allows us to now equip and become empowered so that we can be the men that then becomes the fathers or the extended fathers in other guys' lives. I mean, I'll tell you my own personal story. I mean, very quickly, I grew up again in the inner city, raised by a single mom. Unfortunately, my dad, he decided that he would sell drugs for a living, and ultimately they found him tied to his bedpost, shot 6 times in the head. I was 6 years old. Right, I was 6 years old, and so I grew up without a paternal father figure. And even then, hindsight's always 20/20. Only God knows, but I trust in His sovereignty. It was a good thing because my dad was also abusive to my mom. He knocked her down the stairs. My grandmother told me this. He knocked her down the stairs when she was pregnant with me, and that's what induced her labor. And I was 2 months a preemie. I came out 2 months beforehand, right? So it was crazy. So still dysfunctional dad, dysfunctional father figure. But it was, if it were not for strategically different men coming into my life over time, I can point to them and a couple of uncles at strategic points in my life where I was at a crossroads, guys from my church would, when my mom was off working, they would pick me up and they would take me to swim practice, right? They, my swim coach, there was a time, Ryan, where my mom was like, this is too much. She was going to say, we can't, that I could no longer swim. I was 12 years old. Was
it the time commitment or cost, or what was the issue?
It was a time commitment. Again, okay. Yeah, she worked, she went back to school, became a registered nurse. She was working at the Cleveland Clinic. She just one person, couldn't be in two places at the same time. Sure. Well, my white coach, Jeff Armstrong, talked to my mom, and he's like, you know what, this is great, but Byron has a talent for this. How about I pick him up from school and I take him to practice? That's awesome. In times that you can't pick him up, I'll drop him off. He did that. It was only supposed to be for 1 season. He did that for 3 seasons, man. That guy in my life, and look, he just had a high school education. He didn't have a college education, all right? And here you had this guy, white guy, Fu Manchu, mustache, mullet, driving into the inner city and out, picking up this black kid, because he recognized that this kid has an opportunity. Swimming opened the world to me. Every Saturday, I had an excuse to get out of the hood, and I saw more of what was available to me in life. If anything, it just broadened my perspective. It gave me a bigger picture of what was possible, which then allowed me to orient myself that I could achieve more, right? And so it was because of strategic men over and over again in my life that happened. So even if a person isn't blessed with having a dad in the home, there are men that they can align themselves that can help them along the way. And there are platforms and programs at the very least. If you have a smartphone or access to the internet, you can create virtual fathers that can show and model, anything you want to accomplish.
And, I think there's another part of that story that's really powerful. And your swim coach, that's a seemingly insignificant gesture, right? Like, I'm just going to go pick up this kid. I'm going to take him to practice. He's going to practice. I'm going to drop him off. I'm going to do that 2, 3, 4 times a week. It doesn't seem like a big deal. But I think what we need to realize and understand is that we don't need to save the world.
Right.
We need to do small little tasks on a daily basis that most people would overlook and not consider. Maybe you're not going to be thanked for them, But
Mhm.
man, you never know. And then you look at you and who you've become. And not only that, now you look at how many men you're personally influencing. And a lot of that goes credit to that coach
Yeah.
who took an extra hour out of his day to pick you up and to drop you off. That's very, very powerful.
Yeah, that's powerful. Like the saying, the small things are the big things when it comes to relationships. And guys, again, our culture thinks if it's not big, it's not great. No,
Mm-hmm.
it's the small things we do in the trenches that make all the difference in the world. And so we've got to look at how do we impact the world around us. So yeah, the more faithful we are at our ground game, the more ground we actually gain, right? It's like
Sure.
that's the thing. Is as if you can pound and ground and you can move the needle incrementally and do it consistently, it's just a matter of time before you cross the finish line. And that's the kind of attitude that we as men need to have. Is hey, let's master in our mindset and our skill set acquisition the little stuff that allows us to move the needle in spite of the situations we're in.
Yeah, and then you compound those actions over time and they produce big results. I'm actually really curious because I knew we were having this conversation and I'm glad you brought this up about your white coach. And from my perspective, I think that's probably more common than what is being led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
That there isn't so much tension between races. And I thought about it. I'm like, well, yeah, that would be easy for me to say because of my perspective, right? But I'm really
Mm-hmm.
curious. You as a black man, are you? Do you agree with that? Do you think that that's more common? Do you think that the narrative is more? There's less tension than we're being led to believe. Like, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, good question. I can see because I can see it both ways because I've experienced both sides. I had a Jeff Armstrong in my life who poured into me, and again, just did the little things, right? He did the
Right.
little things, and it made all the difference in my life. At the same time, I can give you another story where 3 times in my life, I was racially profiled. I was actually in high school coming from swim practice. Okay, my the pool was in a upper class rich part of of Cleveland called Shaker Heights,
Okay.
and my mom had scraped up enough money that summer. I was the summer between my ninth and 10th grade year to get me a moped, right? So I had a moped, and I would go to practice and come back. Well, on the way back from practice one of these days, I was driving down, and there's a street called Euclid, and it was the last street that you could be on before there was this hill that you dropped. So you
Okay.
went from the good, nice neighborhood, right, of part of Cleveland, down into the hood, literally.
Right, because it goes from high to low, right?
High to
Economic
low.
status, right?
Right, right. And there was a street that actually epitomized that type of
That
dynamic.
transition.
Yeah, interesting enough. Well, I was going across Euclid intersection, and a police officer who was on the intersecting street, all right, saw me cross the street. Now, I didn't have a helmet on. The helmet was on the back of my thing. So I'm being a knucklehead kid, not thinking about it and all, and I'm riding my bike without a helmet. So I see the cop do a U-turn and come to pull me over. I'm thinking, okay, I'm busted. My mom's gonna kill me because I got this ticket for not wearing a helmet,
Not
right?
wearing your helmet, right?
Yeah, that's all I'm thinking, right? That's all. That's about the extent of it. Long story short, this guy just automatically assumed, this police officer assumed that I stole the moped, and
Mm,
because we couldn't get in touch with my mom, she was at work, and at that time, back in the day, you didn't have cell phones, right? And all. He handcuffed me, got the bike impounded, and I spent the whole entire day in jail
are you
until
serious?
until my mom
Wow.
got off work and could come down to the precinct, prove my identity, and prove that the bike belonged to me. Okay, and guess what? She still at the end of the day had to pay for the impound.
Right.
so so
Oh man.
so I have that example, and I have two other examples I want to get into in college while I was at UCLA. So I can see it from both sides. And this is why, to your point, Ryan, I think it's even more important now than ever before that we have great men showing up in droves, because we have to counteract the dysfunctions, the bad apples. We have to, because
Mm-hmm.
in our society, and again with social media, I mean, in the news, there's a saying in media: what bleeds leads.
Mm.
Okay, that's what that's what mandates the news that goes on all of our channels. Okay, it has to be sensationalized
Right.
because eyeballs, and you know
We
this
need
as
those eyeballs. Yep.
you need the eyeballs because that's tied to our sponsorship and to our audience and our growth, our money. So because we know that that's part of the system, that's the business model that we operate under, we've got to be smarter as men, and we have to actually execute our game, our impact even more vigilantly. So yes, you behind the scenes, I do see a lot of guys, Black, white, Latino, all shapes and sizes, all colors, all walks of life, doing their job, doing their work, but we're not done. It's not over, right? And again, we can't get distracted by pointing the finger and looking at what the other side is doing wrong. Because here's getting into, hopefully we can get into this conversation as well, the idea of Black Lives Matter. The narrative has become law enforcement and Black Lives Matter. It should never, ever be this opposition where if you believe and support one, that means you're an enemy of the other.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense to me because it's an and both situation. The problems that we face in our society are multifaceted and complex. They're not binary. And so it requires people on all sides to work together. And what not for lack of a better term, fear, what concerns me with, and this speaks to your earlier point, what concerns me with what's happening right now in media is that people are weaponizing these issues. Right. And they're using the issues to drive home a political position. And as a result, we're spending more time distracted on our argument, and we spend less time on aggressively actually solving the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the part where I take issue is when you start talking about we're going to tear down and dismantle the entire system because of this systematic racism or injustice. I'm like, look, I'm not downplaying your personal experiences because why would I question those? I've never had those. I don't know what that feels like. So I'm not downplaying that. But I'm also not willing to say that is representation of America at its core foundational level being built as a racist country, and everything about this country is evil. It means that we've got one guy that is ignorant, frankly, or something else, right? An asshole, power hungry, ignorant, a combination of all of those things. And that individual needs either training or needs to be removed from the police department. But that to me is not indicative of let's tear down the entire system. And
right.
That's what I take issue with.
Right. And that's where, again, I think you have, just like on the side of the example I used earlier with the police department wanting to get crime under control, great idea, bad implementation, right? Likewise, I see what the pendulum swing on this other side of, hey, let's now point out what is systemically dysfunctional. And it's now, okay, good idea, but bad implementation. You mentioned something earlier where, it's like this instant gratification. You've got to have the solution quickly. Well, in our day and age, what that is starting to look like when the pendulum has been swinging to the extreme is, cancel culture and tearing down the whole infrastructure, defunding the police, all of these sweeping things that could have quick, vanity metrics, right? It looks really, really good.
Sure.
But they're really not in any substantive way beneficial for the long term. So my concern is, hey, let's stop the pendulum from swinging to one extreme to the next, and let's start looking at and taking a critical eye to what's working in them, what's not working in the system, and then let's double down on what works. Let's correct what doesn't. I think if we approach everything else in our lives that way, in a sane way, when we look at our personal finances, right? We
should be doing that, right?
Right. Exactly. We should be look at our health. I mean, you look at your health, your finances, our relationships, all of these different areas of our lives. we can say, okay, here's what's working, or we should be saying, here's what's not, here's the good, bad, and the ugly. Let me address it. Let me now use my agency to make this thing better. That's the same collectively we should idea and perspective we should have on it. Are there great cops? Yes. I argue that there are more good people in our police force than not. But are there bad cops? Yeah.
Yeah, of
Are
course.
there incentives built within the culture of the police department that allows for bad cops to exist longer than necessary in that system? Yes. Let's be bold enough and be man enough, to go in and correct what's not working. Let's make it in the police department. Let's create a culture where good cops feel safe enough to call out bad cops, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's incentivize how much money each department gets, not by matrix that are going to be instant, but yet matrix that are tied to the longevity and health of the outcome, right? Vice versa. And I'll shut up and give you time to ask another question.
It's good. I like listening to this stuff.
I point the same spotlight on the community, on the inner city, okay, where I grew up. We have to, as men, show up in our communities, okay? We can't depend on the government and the police department to do every single thing for us. We have to find out where we align, and we have to take full ownership of the stuff we need to do to right the ship. Okay, so the onus isn't just on the government. It isn't just on the police department. The onus is on the people in the community as well to do these things. And it has to be an and both, because citizens need the police, all right? And the police need to be better equipped and better trained in order to handle situations. I was talking to 2 police officers. I sit on a task force right now in LA, behind closed doors, and we're getting police officers and community leaders and people together and having candid, vulnerable conversations. And these will never go online because, it's just by the nature of it.
It can't. It's better. It's in certain circumstances, it's better, because otherwise it will become corrupted.
Exactly. And but one thing that's coming out of the conversation are ways to actually, hey, here's what we need from you. Here's how our hands are tied. And each side can be vulnerable and say, here's how our hands are tied. Let's brainstorm on how we can overcome this. And when you create those spaces, then I'm encouraged, because I'm seeing the needle move in the trenches. And the beautiful thing, and you've seen the picture of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
You notice the iceberg at the top, and then you scale out. There's a lot going on underneath the surface.
Sure.
For that little part to be showing through. Likewise, I think we are working underneath the surface, so that ultimately, good things pop through.
Well, and that's good. And it's good we're having conversations like that, because that's actually very hopeful for me, because I see things like the defund the police movement, and you're talking about setting up incentives to rout out the bad and promote the good. And you're talking about, not you personally, but now as a society, we're talking about defunding the police. That's an incentive for losers to join the police department. Yeah. And why would any rational human being who wants to do good, who wants to be able to uphold the law, to serve his community, why would any rational, intelligent, like the people we need, individuals join to that sort of scrutiny and potential charges that they'll lose their life to?
Right. Yeah.
So we're de-incentivizing what it is you're talking about by even having this defund the police conversation. The other problem with it, and here's where I take a lot of issue, not only with defund the police, the term, but also the term, or I should say the organization, Black Lives Matter. These are bait and switch tactics, because what the words mean are different than what's actually being presented. Defund the police doesn't mean kind of fund the police, reorganize the police, restructure the police, it means defund the police. And people will say, oh, no, it doesn't really mean that. Well, those words are being used deliberately. Same thing with
Right.
Black Lives Matter. Does the phrase, the term, the words Black Lives Matter resonate? And is it true? Of course.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody listening to this podcast would say, yes, Black Lives Matter. And that was a genius, albeit deceitful strategy by the Black Lives Matter movement to say, okay, here's the words we're using. Oh, and it also represents being at odds with the nuclear family. Oh, the organizers are also trained Marxists by their own confessions. This is where I take issue, where there's this bait and switch tactic and strategy at play here.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I think you're giving the organization more credit than they deserve, because the genesis or the impetus of that hashtag Black Lives Matter came out of good things. It was solely to identify the spotlight of the dysfunction and the broken relationship between police officers and the community
Sure.
that's been happening over the last 40 years. Again, when we look at Chicago, I just about a year and a half, no, actually, about a year ago, not a year and a half ago, I was just in Chicago, and you know the nickname for the city of the inner city of Chicago. Do you know what the nickname is?
I don't know it.
Chirac.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yes, and the reason why is because there is an area of Chicago that literally, Ryan, looks like and acts like a war zone. All right. Even this past 4th of July, startling statistics have come out. There have been more shootings coming out in Chicago during the 4th of July than what's happened in I think the past decade. Startling. So this is systematic of a system that is broken. You know, the inner city, it's not just the people within the inner city, which is what we like to believe. Okay, these people are just not disciplined. They just don't want to work. We're throwing and we're casting the players of the community as the bad guys, as the villains, and they brought it on themselves. When in fact, when you look at systematically what causes a society, a nation, a state, a city, a community to thrive, you have two acts of capitalism. Okay, you have growth economy and you have deep economy. Really quick, we know growth economy is the faster I can grow my company, the more reach I have. The more reach I have, the more market share I can own. Okay, that's growth economy. That in our country has played out into why we've globalized our efforts economically. Okay, because there's advantage there, there's opportunity there. Well, we also try to operate in America something called a deep economy. Okay, deep capitalism. What that means is at the local level, we are saying we want communities to thrive and fund themselves, meaning the dollar will exchange hands in the community 5 to 7 times before it leaves the community. When a community can do that, the community can sustain itself. And that means property values will go up, crime goes down, schooling goes up because our funding to schools is tied to our property values, and the whole community is lifted. The municipal responsibilities of the community, just taking the trash out. I mean, just to think about where you live. I don't know where you live, Ryan, but you don't have to think about the trash guy, missing a week. Right?
He's coming. He'll be here.
He'll be here. You put the trash out on Monday or Friday or whenever you do, and you don't even think about the trash guy picks it up. Well, that's being funded by a community effort that's tied into how a city or a community operates. And so you've got all these factors. When those things are just imagine what your street will look like if garbage is only picked up once a month. Just that alone undermines what the city actually looks like. And you know what I mean? So I say all that, and then we can extrapolate that when we look at housing, we look at basic maintenance of the city, all those things go down.
Let me ask you on this, because you talk about it being a systematic issue that's broken, and yet if you were to take two cities, Chicago and I don't know, just LA, right? You're in LA?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
it can't be systematic, like federally systematic. Like it can't be across the country because we're seeing different results in different cities, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is across the country. That's why it's systemic, and that's
But
where.
the question though is why? Okay, so why then do we see cities that thrive,
Mhm.
and why do we see cities that fall behind? If the system's the same, if it's applied throughout the country, where's the discrepancy here?
Every city on within our country, has an inner city, has a depressed portion of their lands. I mean, you can even go back out to like the Appalachians and look at the at-risk communities there, and it has nothing to do with the color of your skin. Now, who populates those socioeconomic depressed areas of our cities? In some areas it's more Latino, in some areas it's more Black, but in other areas it's white. So we can take race out of the equation at this point. Now,
Right.
the popular cities that we see, New York, Chicago, Miami, even Los Angeles, when you talk about Watts and Compton and back in the 80s and 90s, the Crips and Bloods, it was huge. It was Latino and Black. So to answer your question, even within the cities, the pockets of themselves, you have city or areas that are depressed and you have areas that thrive. Well, why does one area thrive and the others don't? That's when you have to look at the cash flow and economic drivers that exist within the city. Okay, and it works in combination. All of these moving parts compound on each other. Okay, what I mean is when you have an area that is typically high in crime, let's say, right? Well, businesses that want to grow there, because we know wealth is contingent upon two things: value creation, asset accumulation. All right, you've got to be able to manipulate these two parts in order to build wealth in for yourself, for your family, for your legacy. Well, if you get a Black guy or a Latino guy who wants to launch a business in the inner city, doing everything right, dots the I's, cross the T's, goes to college, you name it, right? Has a great business, wants to do a dry cleaners in the hood. Well, they go to a bank. That bank is less likely to back that business, not because the owner isn't capable, but because of the environment they want to launch their business.
Of
right?
course.
And then you couple that with, okay, if businesses can't grow there and thrive, then commerce within the community suffers. Then let's look at food. Inner cities are our greatest food deserts. Okay, you and we can literally, I can walk 2 blocks and I can, within a half-mile radius of my home, I can show you 5 supermarkets.
Of course.
Okay, right? You go to the inner city, there's not a supermarket within a 2 to 3 mile radius of a given home. They get most of their food from the liquor store. That's the supermarket. Okay, so you talk about health, and then we say the same thing systematically. When property values go down, funding in schools go down. And so all of these things compound on each other, and then you extrapolate that over decades, then you get what we're currently getting. So the flip side is true for thriving neighborhoods. Everything that I mentioned in one side, just flip the coin and you have a thriving community that's growing, not because of the people, okay, but because of the community and the infrastructure that people are allowed to live.
I challenge that it's not the people.
Well,
yes. I would say that it's not only the people.
Exactly.
Because
point taken.
Yeah, I think there has to be some level, because I've seen areas that have thrived at some point and completely fallen apart.
Yeah.
And I've seen other areas that, you used to be like, that used to be the poor area, like you didn't want to go there, and now it's thriving.
Yeah.
Right? So you see those stories where they flip too, and that has to do with certainly some infrastructure, certainly some investment, and certainly people changing their attitudes, changing their habits to produce and create these cycles of growth or decline.
Right. And that's why I say, it's not an either or, it is an and both. That's why, again, you're right. I think the ground game in the inner city, when I use those terms, I'm talking about the people. So you're right. It isn't the people can't be absent of it, because again, I can go and if I have a lawn service, a landscaping thing, I could put the most beautiful landscaping, I could just bling out your backyard, right? And walk away, and you have a beautiful pool, beautiful grass, beautiful trees, nice little grassy knoll, everything. If you don't take care of it, right? If you don't, deal with the patches that come just because of the nature of land, if you don't correct the sprinkler system over time because the heads are broken, if you don't take care of it, then yes, is it going to exist? Is it going to survive? No, it's going to be run down.
Right. This is why I always fall back on education, even within prison systems. We talk about prison reform. I'm like, look, prison reform has to include some element of education. And people will say, well, you're going to pay for these criminals to get college degrees. I'm like, we're paying for them anyways.
Right.
Like, we're paying for them to be there for 10 years, 20 years, potentially their entire lives. And the just insane amount of cost that's going into that. Let's educate these individuals, get them the information they need so they can start making better choices and better decisions and go back to wherever it is that they're from and start helping the communities that they're involved in because they have the information at hand.
Right. And here's where, Ryan, I think the narrative of individual freedoms and the narrative of our nation, as a free nation, get confused. I see a lot of my brothers on, especially my stereotypically right-wing conservative Christian brothers. I prescribe to Christianity. I believe in the life and teachings of Jesus, and a lot of my friends, are very conservative Christian men. I see this idea of co-opting and confusing personal liberty with collective unity that actually is founded in our country. The great part of the great American experiment is this experiment of, hey, can we create an environment where through our independent efforts, we can at the same time create a collective wealth in our nation, right? Now, in order for that to happen, we have to be willing to give up certain levels of our liberty. Okay, the way that plays out, simply speaking, as an example, is our traffic laws. You and I have given up a certain amount of our freedom to how we drive our car,
sure,
for the sake of more and more people being able to safely drive their car. Right?
And it's efficient, and sure, of course.
Exactly, and it's efficient, and it helps
keeps people safe. Right.
Keep people safe. I get to go wherever I want. I get to go to my job. I get to use the roads to make money. So it's a win-win overall. But there is a socialist, or not socialist, but there is a social communal responsibility where we abdicate certain levels of our freedom for the greater good. We
do it with our first responders. We do it with police departments. We do it with the trash collector, like we were talking about earlier. We do it with some of these things.
Exactly. And so, when we're charged and we're looking at what's wrong in our nation, if we can do it soberly and do it courageously, then we say, well, you know what? If I have the means, to then give up a certain percentage to help the penal system get corrected, then all right. Selfishly, my self-interest will ultimately be served, because now I'm helping equip a guy that's not going to be a part of the problem, but he may become part of the solution, right? So I'm willing to front load the investment in making that happen. Does it take a little bit more out of my pocket? Sure, but I can brunt that. When we get so caught up in thinking that what's mine is mine because of the freedom that I have in this country, and we forget about the responsibility that with freedom comes responsibility, then I think that's when we open ourselves up to again, just kind of messing things up.
Well, I think part of the problem, and I'm on board with that. We talk about these things like I'm a libertarian, and yet, if somebody breaks into your house, I bet you'd be willing to call the police, right? So it's like, are you truly? Or are you just paying a lip service?
Right.
Okay, so I realize there's elements of that. The problem that I think a lot of individuals have, myself included, with some of these programs, is I don't trust the government to do a good job.
Yeah.
So I don't trust them to do a good job with the school system. We homeschool our children too, by the way, just like you guys do.
Mhm.
Because partly because of that, I don't trust the government to do what I can do and should take some responsibility for myself.
Right.
That's where I take issue, is that if I was assured that the resources and the money was going to be used to produce what we've talked about, then by all means, same thing with Social Security.
Mhm.
You know, Social Security's broke. It wasn't supposed to be touched, and now it's broke because the government got its greedy hands in this collective system that was supposed to help and serve our elderly population.
Yeah. And here's the thing, when we're talking about, the government and like the penal system, our jails, well, one of the mistakes the government has made is privatizing jails, giving jails the management of our judicial system over to the private sector in a way where, again, the incentives are to populate the prisons,
Right.
and to keep people more in jail because it pads their pocket. So,
Right.
so I think, again, I always go back to that phrase, the great American experiment. It's a beautiful idea and ideology that we're trying to figure out, but it's very complicated in its implementation, because while we do need government, we don't need a corrupt or a government that is so fat that it becomes dysfunctional. And I think that's where we are. And that's where the balance comes in. We need government to help us, be fair to one another, right? Because in our own human nature, left to our own devices, fear and greed drive us primally. Okay. And so we need referees in order to guard up against that. Now, hopefully that can be mitigated a lot when, of course, going back to you and I saying it earlier, men, when we take more ownership in our self-efficacy, right? And then in our own identity, then we don't need to be policed as much, right?
Because the problem is if the referee's been bought off, we've got an issue here. Somebody's going to be better served at the expense of the other party.
Right, exactly. There's something in sports. We see this growing up. I don't know. Do you play tennis, or do you play like volleyball or anything like that? Or
in high school, I played football, baseball. I wrestled, played a little basketball.
Yeah. So, even you take the example of wrestling, a lot of times in practice when you guys are off and you're working on technique and you're doing sparring matches, you police yourselves, right?
Right.
You don't have a referee there. You know what's out of bounds. You know what's off limits. And you respect your opponent enough to, hey, if I've stepped out of the bounds, you go, my bad. Or or he points it out that, hey, look, you're like, okay. And then it's dealt with in the moment, and then you continue. Right? That's the way, altruistically, that's the way we're supposed to be operating in America. And that's what will make America great, is if we all take that type of ownership and that collective commitment. As I make myself better, I'm going to make you better. Iron sharpens iron. Likewise, if you make yourself better, my hope is that part of your incentive as well is to make me better. And that's how it's going to continue to grow. And then that begins to compound. And then we start to see exponential benefits in every area of our life.
Yeah, I think what we understand, and you understand this because you were swimming at the highest levels, and anybody who's participated in competitive sports knows this instinctively, that it's a competition, you're trying to win, but also it's a cooperation.
Yep.
Right? Because look, you go in to compete. Like I go in to compete against you, and you would literally swim laps around me, right? But you and I go and we compete, and we say, hey, I'm going to try to beat you, and you're going to try to beat me. But we're going to agree to these set rules, and if we don't adhere to these rules, there's going to be penalties. Like if you're on the football field and you cross the line of scrimmage before you're supposed to, there's a 10-yard penalty, right? Yeah. So, and we are so committed to the cooperation that we are both willing to even bring in a third party to do it.
Yep.
And I think that's what we need to understand as a country as well, is that we're not competing with each other.
Right.
Let's cooperate. Like, let's work together so everybody can be better served.
It's a co-opetition, right?
Yes. Great. Yeah. Good point.
When you look at what the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, when he talks about the invisible hand of competition,
Mm-hmm.
competition is a good thing. That's great. But when we look at sports, we look at football, all right? A football game that's well refereed, the referees are invisible. We don't even
Mm.
notice them on the field, right?
Right.
A good game or a bad game that's poorly refereed, we see them all day.
Yeah.
Likewise with our government. When our government's running well, it should be running behind the scenes, and we should never really see it. We should be beneficiaries of it being run well. If we're seeing too much of it, that's just an indication that it's not running well, and then we got to correct it.
Well, let's riff on this analogy even a little bit more. We need to understand the role of government. And from my perspective, the role of government is to play the referee. But guess what the referee doesn't do? The
Mm-hmm.
referee doesn't make the rules.
Right.
The players decide these are the rules we're going to follow. The
Yep.
referee is there to make sure both sides honor the rules and there's a level playing field.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
that's where our government has gone wrong, is that they believe that they're supposed to dictate and make all these rules and dictate how we're supposed to live our lives. No, actually, you're supposed to get the hell out of the way
Mm-hmm.
and only interject when there's some sort of crossing of the line or breaking of a rule, and then
Mm-hmm.
just so you can level the playing field again and then get out of the way.
Exactly. I mean, that's how it's supposed to run. And it's why our founding fathers, when creating the infrastructure of government initially, built into it that the criteria of the man that was supposed to take the helm for a period of time. They had to be, good upstanding citizens within their community, great reputation. They had to be, successful in business. They had to have have stewarded their family well. These were all of the prerequisites to then, for a certain period, you would go and serve the best interest of your community and of your nation. And then after that time, you would then return back to
Right.
your vocation. That's who,
Right.
we
Civic duty,
have,
not an opportunity to build insane levels of
right,
wealth and stay there forever.
it's not, they're not career politicians, right? That's not my business. Because now what you have is, when my livelihood and my money, my bank account is tied to how I posture and peacock as a politician, then I'm going to get really good at posturing and peacocking, because I'm going to get paid. No peas, pun intended, right? But, and that's where we're dysfunctional. That's where I think we've run amok. And yeah, is this my armchair quarterback assessment? Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm seeing. And so where I have hope in all of this, though, Ryan, is that I think now more than ever before, more people have an opportunity to go back to what I mentioned earlier about how do we accumulate wealth. It's value creation and asset accumulation. Back in the Industrial Revolution, most of that came in form of land. If you had an opportunity to get land, then you were able to set your family on a trajectory that could build wealth. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and we know that up until now, up until the turn of the century, that the vast majority of our millionaires, made their money in real estate and then funneled that into different businesses and all. Well, I think the tide is changing now with this platform of the internet, where now we have new modes of value creation and asset accumulation that can come from online-based endeavors and app development and also. So the new real estate, there's a new real estate being created for us. And my hope is that we don't, as a nation, and specifically I'll speak to my African-American brothers and sisters, we don't get so distracted by the injustices that do happen that we forfeit our own agency so much that we don't capitalize on the opportunities that are actually right in front of us.
Right.
That's my hope, is that we can, let's call out and let's right the wrongs that we can, but let it not take us off our own personal gain.
I'm glad you said that. And I wanted to say something at the risk of maybe being offensive, and I certainly don't intend it this way. But from my perspective, it seems like the powers that be, the government and those that would be in control and authority, are playing the black community against itself. That's what I see. And so when I hear you say, hey, we can't be distracted, like, yes, there's things that happen, and those things need to be addressed. And individuals that do injustices should be brought to justice. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But also, let's focus on the things that can help us be in a better position, be in a better spot collectively.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there, because this is where it's touchy, and this is where when I'm talking to my African American brothers and sisters, and all, I go back to it's an and both. Now, what is destructive and doesn't aid the conversation or add value to the conversation is when that becomes your primary megahorn. When you hear and bless her heart, I think that Candace Owens is a great person. I'm not trying to put her on blast right now, but she's just the first person that comes to mind. I'd look at Elder, I forgot his name too. There are a lot of conservative African American, right wing Republican African Americans who find their job, it seems, at holding a megaphone up, pointing out all of the wrong of the Black community. And then that becomes a voice where you get other white Anglo-Saxon people saying, look, that's, yes, those are the problems, those are the problems. Yeah, they are the problems. I don't disagree with you on that at all. My issue is when you use a political party, and not even Democrat. Personally, I'm independent, just for the record and all. I don't prescribe to Democratic or Republican ideologies independently. I think both are two sides of the same coin, and there's good in both, and they were designed to be that way. But that being said, you have career politicians who are weaponizing the different movements on if we use
both sides,
both sides, right? And again, I think it's a tactic. When you have someone like Donald Trump, I grew up, I read The Art of the Deal. I respected him a lot I think his superpower is his ability to promote and market. I think that's what allowed him to really grow and be successful in business, is he has that ability. And the 80-20 rule applies. If I, from sheerly a business mind, assess where his strengths and weaknesses, I was like, okay, he doubled down on what his strengths are. And, he's been very accomplished. I think he's great at promoting and marketing and commanding the narrative. Well, when you get a guy like that who didn't grow up poor, can market himself as the blue-collar billionaire and speak to the woes and the pain of a marginalized, socioeconomically low white community, right? Okay, because that's whose voice wasn't being heard during the previous administration. So their issues and problems on the ground level were not being addressed, much like the inner city. Okay, so it's the same thing. Let's take race out of it. It's the same socioeconomic issues that people are burdened with, that cause us to act out. And I say us collectively as a human race, cause us to act out. So when you can have a guy like that strategically do that, now I'll tell you, my personal stance is, because this is what I'm taught through my biblical worldview, that whoever is in leadership, we are to honor and respect those that are in leadership. But at the same time, we also have to continue to speak truth to power. I said this when Obama was in office, and I say this with Trump being in office. So I want to also make that very clear. The scrutiny that I have on our leaders, whose voice can travel the farthest, I think that there's a higher call and responsibility, just like I would expect my son and his friends to hold me more accountable to the influence that I have in their lives than his peers. My son should hold me up to a higher standard than he holds his buddies, right?
Sure,
just because of the nature of my position. And I should be able to embrace that and accept that reality, and then respond to it, show up to it in that way, in an empowered way.
Well, and I think when you have, like yourself, an intelligent man who's willing to discuss that, who's willing to criticize, but not just criticize to one side, that's right. That's where, and you said you don't, that's where issue gets taken, is like, okay, you're very critical of this, but what happened when this president was saying the same thing? Yeah. I didn't hear you criticizing it then. Yeah. Right. And you hate to get into the like whataboutism type game, but It is interesting, and I'm not going to say that I'm unbiased. We all have biases, right?
Yeah, right.
But I think that if we want to be taken seriously as men, then our criticism and our praise in every other way that we conduct ourselves ought to be even keel across the board, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of color of skin, regardless of whatever, and just look at the merits of what this individual is doing. Mm-hmm. Who he is, be damned, right? It's like, what are the merits of what this individual is doing?
Right. And again, you can have on either side, and this goes back to, again, and I think we're saying the same thing. When you can get an individual operating within a dysfunctional system, the government, then no matter how good or well-intentioned that person is, if the quote unquote other side, if they're hell-bent on digging in their heels because of political posturing, then it doesn't work. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, if Republican is in office, if the Democratic side digs in their heels and tries to, cut the nose despite the face, it's not going to work. Likewise, if there is a Democrat in office and the Republicans want to just dig in their heels, it's not going to work. And then ultimately, who suffers? The American people. And a nation divided amongst itself, Scripture says, will fall. And so that's what, again, I think the caution that we all have is, hey, if we don't, and sorry for all of my analogies, I hope they make sense, but if you and I are in the same boat, and if our mission is to get our boat across the water, okay, we're both responsible for two things, all right? Number one, we're both responsible to do our part in rowing the boat. And secondly, we're both responsible for identifying and checking out that the hull of the boat remains healthy. Sure. If there are holes in the boat and all, then and we don't fix the holes in the boat, no matter how good we are at rowing the boat, it's just a matter of time before that thing sinks. So we have to both be working on the system as well as working in the system. We're both in the boat, working on the boat while we're trying to get this thing across the water. That's I think the mindset, and that's kind of the voice that I'm trying to. That's what I want to bring to the table. So when I talk to people, in fact, I'm going to jump off of our call, and I'm going to jump on another call with an organization that's trying to figure out what does this look like, within our company. I think if we get enough people wanting to recognize where they're seated in the boat, and then agree that we're all in the same boat, then now the issue is, let's figure out how do we keep the boat healthy, and then how do we make it so that you can operate at your best while at the same time I can operate at my best.
Yeah, and I think also important to that is ensuring that we're both in agreement that we're rowing to the same shore.
Yeah.
Right, because if I'm rowing one way and you're rowing the other, that's going to create a lot of contention amongst you and I.
Right. Which and again, I probably your listeners are like, man, they use a lot of analogies and beat these things to death. But
well, analogies are important for me. It has to be dumbed down so I can understand some of these concepts. I'm all about analogies, man.
Yeah, I'm a framework guy as well. And again, that's why it's so important for there to always be checkpoints, milestones, and assessments. I mean, again, when you look at what you're building, the community that you're building with, I just forgot the name. I
Order Man. Yeah, no, it's okay.
Order Man. Yeah, Order Man, but the Iron Council. That's what I'm saying. The Iron Council.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the Iron Council, you as the founding member of this and facilitator and growing, and you wear multiple hats. You wear the hat of a practitioner. You're not like, I'm the king and I'm just gonna dictate this stuff, right? No, you're like, sure. I'm a player coach in this. I'm in it with you. So you're tasked with the responsibility of doing what you can to uphold the tenets of the Iron Council. At the same time, you hold the responsibility and the platform of creating and facilitating and nurturing an environment so that every other man is free to explore and do the same, right? They all have to feel safe enough within the community to allow their ugly side to come out so that it can be healed, right?
Right. So you can fix it.
Right. So you're charged with again being in the boat, working on the boat, working to make the boat move forward. and all, but everybody has to have the same and shared outcome for themselves,
Hmm.
right? And then I think what works is something that you've inherently built into your tribe, which I think is beautiful. And I'm not trying to, people are like, he's just trying to plug Iron Council. No, I think it's a great thing. I'm not a member. He's not paying me to say this. But what I think dynamically you've learned intuitively is that it's both an art and a science.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, there's curriculum and there's scaffolding and there's structure to allow people to operate so that no one gets lost and everyone keeps the main thing the main thing. But
Hmm.
there's also within that structure enough freedom and autonomy for people to interpret and metabolize that stuff for themselves.
Right. In a way
They've
that's
got to
meaningful
write,
for them.
yeah, exactly. They've got to make it meaningful for them. And so it's a balancing act for you. Likewise, that's what it is for our leaders in government. That's what it is for us as men leading a nation. We've got to understand that, yeah, we may cross, hairs on objectives because at any given season, I could be going in this direction while you're going in this direction. Why? Because we're on our own path.
Yeah.
But what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that when we do cross paths, it's not a collision,
Hmm.
right? And that's
And
how
the
we have to work.
and the best way to do that, Byron, I think in my experience, is communicate.
Yeah,
Here I am. Here's where I'm going. Here I am. Here's where I'm going. All right, let's work together so we don't crash into each other or whatever here. And I
exactly.
think that's what's missing. That's a big part of what's missing in society. Everybody's butting heads and crashing. It's like just talk, which is why I think this conversation and these podcasts are so powerful because we're
Yeah,
talking, we're hashing this stuff out. And
exactly.
maybe an hour and a half later, maybe we're not any closer to a solution, but we're on the right path. Now we open the framework for other people to start thinking. You and I have a better relationship. It's a
Hmm.
movement in the right direction, and that's why conversation is so important.
I'm with you. I'm with you, man. And my hope is that we can get more courageous men to be willing. And here's the last thing, and then I'll shut up. I know you're trying to land the plane, and I keep trying to make it take off again.
Just keep
But
going.
but here's my hope for men is that in addition to making sure that we hold ourselves accountable and ourselves in check at the individual level, that we will also demonstrate the courage to hold our counterparts in check,
Yeah.
the men in our own camp, as opposed to be afraid to speak up when that guy is actually out of line. So
Hmm.
when I see another guy in my camp weaponizing an issue and turning it into an agenda or turning it into a means to drive their own agenda, I've got to have the confidence and I have to have the willingness to now speak into that, call that brother out, right? Um, I don't see enough of that. I don't see enough of that in the trenches. And I'm in the trenches in these unique situations enough to recognize and point out that that's a commonality among these different groups. And we're getting caught up in our own silos. And then within these silos, we become more concerned with the status that we hold in our silos than we are upholding the truth in our silos.
Hmm.
And my hope is that we have men who want to speak truth to power within our own silos and then hold ourselves to that same standard.
I like it, man. I like it. Well, I know you've got another meeting, it sounds like. Where do we connect with you, learn more about what you're all about and what you're doing? Let the guys know.
Yeah, well, thanks. Anything that I'm doing can be found out on byron.cc, byron.cc. That's kind of the central hub to the stuff that I'm going and that I'm doing. That's about it.
Right on. We'll sync it up for the guys. Byron, I appreciate you and how you show up. I appreciate this conversation. Man, really, really powerful stuff. I know the guys are going to get a lot of value from it. And we'll have to do another round at some point.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I appreciate you, brother, and what you're doing. Yeah, let's keep driving this ball forward.
All right. Thanks, man.